Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, this podcast is about all things guitar. Hey everyone, welcome into Shad's Guitar Show, and thanks for joining me for this episode, which I think is going to be kind of cool. We're going to talk about one of my favorite players and one of the most highly regarded and widely accepted as one of the all-time greatest jazz guitar players of all time, the late Mr. Wes Montgomery. We're going to get into his early life. We're going to talk a little bit about how he got started and just sort of discuss Wes in general and the massive impact that he had on jazz guitar. And it has reached well beyond just jazz and affected a lot of other areas of music. A lot of guys cite him as an influence and have borrowed from his styles. So we're going to get into all of that. But before we do, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for sharing the show with your friends, for doing anything you can to promote, whether it's leaving a comment or a review. I greatly appreciate it all, and the show is growing, and I just couldn't be more thankful for you guys. So let's dive into the story of one of the most influential and beloved guitarists in jazz history, the late Wes Montgomery. A man whose playing didn't just change the sound of jazz guitar, it defined it. Wes was born in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1923 as part of a large musical family. But what's really amazing about Wes is how late he got started playing, and also that he was completely self-taught. He didn't even pick up a guitar until he was around 19, and he did that after hearing a Charlie Christian record. And that recording lit a fire in him, and he became obsessed with figuring out those lines. And remember, this was way before the internet, before YouTube, or even access to much real music education. So Wes bought himself a guitar and started learning by ear. He didn't have any formal lessons, as we discussed, and knew really nothing about music theory. It came down to just hours of listening and repeating. In fact, his neighbors would say that he would sit up all night working out solos note for note until sunrise. He worked as a welder by day, played clubs at night, and practiced every opportunity he had. Despite his lack of formal training, Wes developed an incredibly sophisticated approach to harmony, phrasing, and improvisation. He couldn't read music, but he could feel it. Everything he did was intuitive. He learned to navigate complex chord changes simply by sound and muscle memory. And that's why his playing has that raw emotional flow. It's direct from ear to hand. And Wes's most famous trait is his right hand technique. Instead of using a pick, he plucked the strings with the side of his thumb. He started doing this to keep from waking the family when practicing at night, but it became his signature tone, warm, round, and smooth. And if you've listened to Wes much, you'll note that he uses a lot of octaves in his playing. And that thumb technique is really perfect for that sound. It just gives this really nice, smooth, percussive attack when playing octaves. And a lot of the octave lines he plays are so fast and fluid, it's absolutely amazing. So let's discuss some of the fundamental and most famous recordings from Wes. By the late 1950s, Wes was recording with Lionel Hampton and later formed his own small groups. Some of the most celebrated albums include The Incredible Jazz Guitar of Wes Montgomery from 1960. And this is a must-listen classic that features 4-on-6 and West Coast Blues, two of Wes's most famous recordings. Then there's Smokin' at the Half Note from 1965, recorded live with Wynton Kelly Trio. This one is legendary for its energy and interaction between the players. Full House from 1962, featuring Johnny Griffin and Wynton Kelly again. A perfect balance of bop fire and melodic grace. And there's Bumpin', Tequila, A Day in the Life, later records that pushed into more commercial territory and ultimately brought Wes's sound to a wider audience. These recordings are essential listening, not just for jazz fans, but for any guitarist who wants to understand phrasing, tone, and melodic storytelling. All right, so let's discuss a little bit about Wes's gear. While a few of his earliest recordings pictured Wes with a Gibson ES 175, for most of his recording and performing career, he played various models of the venerable Gibson L5 CES. In the European videos on YouTube of Wes rehearsing, you can hear him talk about how the L5 was a better instrument because it played more in tune than his earlier guitars. So here's a list of the L5 guitars that Wes used over the years, from earliest to latest. Alright, so the first L5 is a beautiful Sunburst L5 CES. Now, let's talk a little bit about that. The CES is cutaway electric Spanish. Now, I've discussed this in another episode earlier on when I talked about the ES335 models, but CES cutaway electric Spanish means that the guitar has a cutaway, obviously, but electric Spanish means that the guitar is played in an upright position, like a Spanish guitar or an acoustic guitar. This one had a Venetian cutaway, and if you're not familiar, the Venetian is the round cutaway, and two black P90 pickups. Now, this was obviously an older L5. As Wes went on to play L5s with humbuckers from this time on, but obviously this was prior to humbuckers in 1957. And we can hear this particular guitar on his Boss Guitar album. Next is the L5 CESN, and the N at the end designates that it's a natural color. And this also has the Venetian cutaway, but this time it has two humbucking pickups. And we can hear this on Wes Montgomery's live album from Subo in Berkeley, California. Number 3 is another Sunburst L5 CES with a Florentine cutaway. Now, the Florentine is the sharp cutaway. This one also has two humbucking pickups. And this we hear on Live at the BBC Studios from 1965. The fourth, and another Sunburst L5 CES with Venetian cutaway and one humbucking neck pickup and a pearl inlay heart with Wes's name inscribed on it. The story goes that the inlay was put there to cover up a hole made by Wes's fingers rubbing against the wood. This was the first time Wes put his name on his L5. This guitar was later damaged in a fire and subsequently restored by Mike McGuire of Gibson's Custom Shop. We hear Wes using this guitar on Wes Montgomery Quartet live in Belgium from 1965. Number 5 is a Sunburst L5 CES with Venetian cutaway and one neck pickup and a big black sticker on the cutaway bout with Wes's name in white letters. This was his last L5. Wes's last two L5s were custom made for him by Gibson because they didn't make a stock single pickup L5 CES at the time. Even though Wes was a major guitar star, Gibson did not make a Wes Montgomery model of the L5 until decades after Wes had passed in 1968. Wes did not have an official signature guitar model during his lifetime. The instruments he played were custom-built or standard models, not specifically marketed with his endorsement in the way modern signature guitars are. The Washburn J6 and J6S models, produced from the late 1980s through at least the mid-2000s, were designed as a tribute to the style of archtop guitar he favored, and were similar to the Gibson L5, and they featured his name as part of a model name that attracted jazz enthusiasts. The fact that Washburn widely produced these models and used the name on the instruments and in the marketing materials for many years indicates that they had the necessary legal rights to do so. Alright, so Wes was primarily associated with just a couple of different amplifiers. In the early days, he would use Fender Super Reverb or Deluxe Reverb on the early recordings, and he often would borrow a Deluxe from Kenny Burrell, actually. But later on, he went on to use the Standell Super Custom 15, and this was his primary live and later period amp, and it was a solid-state amp made in the mid-1960s, and it had a very characteristic sound. It was 70 watts and used a JBL speaker. So let's touch on Wes's influence on modern players. You can hear it in players like George Benson, Pat Metheny, Lee Ritenour, Joe Pass, Larry Carlton. So many jazz greats have used Wes's technique, his chord solos, his melodic sensibility as a blueprint for their own modern jazz guitar. But even beyond jazz, players in blues, soul, R&B, they've all borrowed from Wes. From Jimi Hendrix to Stevie Ray Vaughan to John Scofield. He died of a heart attack in 1968 at the age of only 45 years old. But in the short time he was around, he changed the language of jazz guitar forever. And he proved that with a good ear, great feel, and tons of soul, you could build an entirely new musical vocabulary. And maybe the most inspiring part is, on paper, Wes Montgomery should not have been one of the greats. He didn't have the training, the background, or the big breaks early on. He just had a guitar, a record player, and a dream. So that'll do it for this episode on Wes Montgomery. Kind of a short trip into the life and legacy of one of the greatest jazz guitar players of all time. I've also linked a Spotify playlist below in the show notes that you can check out. It's just got a handful of my favorite Wes Montgomery tunes and ones that provide a great reference for just what a master of jazz guitar that Wes actually was. So thanks for joining me for this episode, and never forget, the greatest guitarist is the one who's having the most fun.